Miners carved over 12,000 feet of tunnel into solid rock. High in Wyoming's Absaroka Mountains, almost none of that tunnel ever produced real gold. Millions of dollars went into this mountain. Investors believed they'd found the next great strike. The mountain had other plans. And so did the winter waiting for this town. Quick question before we dive in, where are you watching from today? This was supposed to be Wyoming's next great gold boom. Almost none of the gold ever actually left the mountain. In 1885, a man named William Kerwin went hunting deer with his friend Harry Adams. They weren't looking for gold. They stumbled onto it anyway, discovering rich deposits of gold and silver on a remote peak called Spar Mountain. News like this didn't stay quiet for long. Prospectors began arriving from across the region, drawn by rumors of a fresh strike hidden deep in Wyoming's rugged Absaroka Range. This wasn't an easy place to reach. Steep terrain, brutal winters, and genuine isolation kept most casual fortune seekers away. Only the most determined prospectors made the journey. Those who stayed found enough promise to justify serious investment. By the early 1900s, real money started flowing into the area, backed by companies willing to bet heavily on Kerwin's potential. 3 major operations led this push: the Shoshone Mining and Development Company, Galena Ridge Mining Company, Wyoming Mining Company. Combined, these companies poured somewhere between $1 million and $4 million into the site. For a remote mountain camp accessible only by rough trail, that represented an enormous financial commitment. Confidence ran high throughout this period. Nobody sinks this kind of money into isolated Wyoming wilderness without genuinely believing the returns will justify every dollar spent. Building anything here required overcoming serious logistical challenges first. Materials, equipment, and supplies all needed transport across difficult terrain, often using stagecoaches running the demanding route between Kerwin and the nearest town, Meeteetse. Despite these obstacles, construction moved forward steadily. Investors wanted infrastructure capable of supporting serious long-term mining operations, not just a temporary prospectors' camp thrown together carelessly. This meant building real permanent structures, housing for workers and families, commercial buildings supporting daily life, facilities specifically designed for processing extracted ore. Every dollar invested represented genuine faith in what lay beneath Spar Mountain's surface. Company executives clearly believed Kerwin would become one of Wyoming's defining mining success stories. Miners flooded into the growing settlement throughout these early boom years, drawn by steady wages and the promise of a genuinely modern operation, despite operating in one of the most isolated corners of the entire state. Nobody involved in these early investments could have predicted exactly how this story would eventually unfold. For now, ambition and capital were flowing freely into a remote Wyoming mountainside that seemed destined for lasting prosperity. The money poured in fast. Getting the gold back out would prove to be a very different problem. Kerwin grew rapidly once serious investment arrived, transforming from a rough prospectors' camp into something resembling a genuine town. At its peak, roughly 200 residents called Kerwin home, miners and their families building lives together in this remote mountain setting. 38 separate buildings eventually made up the town. A 2-story hotel offered lodging for visitors and newcomers. 2 general stores supplied residents with daily necessities they couldn't easily produce themselves. A post office connected Kerwin to the outside world, while boarding houses, cabins, stables, and meat storage sheds supported the practical needs of daily mountain life. Remarkably, Kerwin reportedly featured electricity and telephone service, genuinely modern amenities rarely found in such an isolated location during this era. Some accounts even call it the most modern mining town in all of Wyoming at the time. Stagecoaches ran regularly between Kerwin and Meeteetse, connecting this remote settlement to broader civilization every other day, weather permitting. Behind this impressive facade, though, actual mining work remained genuinely brutal. Workers descended into underground shafts using simple buckets, lowered into darkness by rope and pulley systems operated from the surface. Gas lanterns provided the only underground lighting available. Miners worked entire shifts by this flickering, inadequate illumination, straining to see rock formations and navigate increasingly dangerous tunnel passages. Breathing conditions underground proved genuinely hazardous too. Constant exposure to rock dust led many miners towards serious lung disease, a slow, cumulative cost that wouldn't fully manifest until years after exposure began. If you're enjoying stories like this, hit subscribe. We cover forgotten history like this every week. Explosions represented another constant danger throughout Kerwin's mining operations. Primitive equipment and imprecise timing devices meant miners regularly risked serious injury, sometimes losing limbs or lives to poorly executed blasting work. This combination, impressive surface infrastructure paired with genuinely dangerous underground labor, defined daily life throughout Kerwin's boom years. From the outside, visitors saw a thriving modern settlement, complete with amenities matching many established towns found at lower, more accessible elevations throughout Wyoming. Underground, though, workers faced constant physical danger, breathing hazardous dust and risking their lives daily, all in pursuit of gold deposits that companies remained confident would eventually justify every risk taken. The town looked like a success story. Deep underground, the numbers told a very different one. By 1906, Kerwin's mining operations had reached genuinely impressive scale, at least in terms of raw excavation effort. 18 separate mines operated throughout the area surrounding the town. Combined, these operations had dug somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 linear feet of exploratory tunnel. Consider that distance for a moment. Nearly 3 miles of tunnel carved entirely through solid rock, using tools and techniques that remained fundamentally manual throughout this entire period. Workers pushed these tunnels to genuinely serious depths too, reaching between 500 and 1,500 feet beneath the mountain's surface in various locations throughout the mining district. Every foot of this excavation required intense physical labor. No power drills existed to speed this process along. No mechanized equipment could substitute for hands, hammers, and carefully placed explosive charges. This represented years of accumulated effort from dozens of miners, working brutal shifts underground, systematically expanding tunnel networks in pursuit of profitable ore veins running through the mountain. Here's where Kerwin's story takes a genuinely sobering turn, though. Despite this staggering excavation effort, despite millions of dollars invested, despite years of continuous labor, the actual mining results proved remarkably disappointing. Only one confirmed carload of ore was ever successfully shipped out from Kerwin's extensive tunnel network. This single shipment came from a specific location known as the No. 2 Byron Tunnel. Even this modest success carried limited financial value. That shipped ore netted just $65 per ton, a genuinely underwhelming return considering everything invested in reaching it. Think about what this actually means. Companies had spent between $1 million and $4 million. Workers had carved nearly 3 miles of tunnel through solid rock. Years of dangerous labor had gone into this operation. The tangible result amounted to essentially one shipment of low-value ore, not the sustained, profitable gold and silver production that had justified such enormous initial investment. This gap between effort invested and results achieved represents something genuinely tragic about Kerwin's story. Miners had risked serious injury and long-term health damage. Companies had committed enormous financial resources. Nature simply hadn't provided the payoff everyone had confidently expected when this ambitious project first began. Whatever rich deposits investors believed existed throughout the mountain largely failed to materialize at profitable, extractable scale. Kerwin stood as a genuine engineering achievement in one specific sense, an extraordinary amount of hand-dug tunnel completed under extremely difficult conditions. As a mining operation, though, the actual returns simply never matched the ambition behind them. The mountain had already taken years of labor and millions of dollars. It was about to take something far more sudden. Kerwin's location created problems that had nothing to do with disappointing ore yields. The town sat directly at the base of peaks reaching roughly 12,000 feet in elevation. This dramatic mountain terrain, while scenic, carried genuine seasonal danger that residents couldn't simply engineer away. Snow accumulated heavily throughout Kerwin's brutal mountain winters, building up on steep slopes surrounding the settlement below. The U.S. Forest Service would later describe this specific danger using a grim, fitting term, "White Death." Avalanches represented a constant seasonal threat throughout the region, an ever-present risk that long-time residents understood intimately, even if they couldn't fully predict exactly when conditions might turn genuinely catastrophic. Winter 1907 arrived with particular severity. Blizzard conditions settled over Kerwin and refused to let up, dumping snow continuously across the surrounding mountainside for 8 consecutive days. By the time this storm finally eased, accumulated snowfall exceeded 50 feet in depth across the slopes directly above town. That's an almost incomprehensible amount of snow, building tremendous unstable weight across terrain already prone to sudden collapse. Residents throughout Kerwin had lived alongside avalanche risk for years by this point. Previous close calls and near misses had taught the community genuine respect for what these mountains could unleash without warning. Still, understanding a risk intellectually doesn't necessarily prepare anyone for confronting it directly. 50 feet of accumulated snow represented conditions far beyond typical seasonal patterns, even for residents accustomed to harsh mountain winters. Mining operations continued throughout this dangerous winter period, though. Workers still descended into underground shafts daily, still pursued the elusive, profitable ore deposits everyone remained confident existed somewhere throughout the mountain's extensive tunnel network. Above ground, families continued their daily routines too, largely unaware exactly how precarious their situation had genuinely become as snow continued accumulating on unstable slopes overhead. Nobody could predict the exact moment when accumulated pressure might finally overcome friction holding that massive snowpack in place. Mountain communities throughout history have faced this same fundamental uncertainty, understanding danger exists without knowing precisely when it might arrive. For Kerwin's roughly 200 residents, this uncertainty was about to end abruptly. 8 days of relentless snowfall had created conditions that mountain terrain simply couldn't sustain indefinitely. Something had to give eventually. Nobody in Kerwin knew exactly when or how devastating the consequences would ultimately prove for their small, isolated mining community. 50 feet of snow had built up above Kerwin. On the night of February 5th, it finally let go. The night of February 5th, 1907, brought exactly the disaster Kerwin's residents had feared throughout that brutal, snow-heavy winter. A massive avalanche broke loose from Brown Mountain, directly above the settlement. Roughly 300 feet wide, this wall of snow and debris roared downward with tremendous, unstoppable force. Buildings throughout Kerwin's lower sections stood directly in this avalanche's path. Structures that had taken years to construct simply couldn't withstand the sheer physical force bearing down upon them. Several buildings were destroyed outright, crushed or swept away entirely by the advancing snow. Some structures ended up pushed directly into the nearby Wood River, carried along by the avalanche's tremendous momentum. Casualties resulted from this sudden catastrophe. Reports vary slightly between 3 and 4 confirmed deaths, residents caught directly in the avalanche's destructive path with no meaningful warning or opportunity to escape. Survivors throughout Kerwin faced immediate, genuine terror in this disaster's aftermath. The mountain that had provided their livelihood, however disappointing the actual mining returns, had just demonstrated genuinely lethal power without warning. Fear spread quickly throughout the remaining community. If one avalanche could strike with such devastating sudden force, what guarantee existed against a similar disaster striking again during this same brutal winter season? Many residents made immediate decisions following this tragedy. Rather than risking continued exposure to further avalanche danger, families began preparing to leave Kerwin entirely, abandoning homes and possessions rather than facing similar risk again. Winter conditions initially prevented immediate mass evacuation, though. Roads remained impassable, and safely traveling the difficult route toward Meetsy required waiting for genuinely safer conditions. Spring finally brought the opportunity many residents had been anticipating. As snow gradually melted and mountain travel became feasible again, most remaining Kerwin residents packed whatever belongings they could reasonably carry and left permanently. This departure happened relatively quickly once conditions allowed it. Families who'd invested years building lives in this remote mountain settlement chose to abandon that investment entirely rather than risk another devastating winter. Tools, furniture, mining equipment, and countless personal possessions simply stayed behind throughout this rapid exodus. Nobody wanted to slow their departure by attempting to transport everything they owned across difficult mountain terrain. Within a relatively short period following the avalanche, Kerwin transformed from a functioning community of roughly 200 residents into something approaching a genuine ghost town, buildings standing empty, equipment abandoned exactly where workers had last used it. The mountain that had failed to deliver promised riches through mining had instead delivered sudden, undeniable tragedy, effectively ending Kerwin's brief existence as a functioning settlement. Kerwin didn't fail slowly, the way most mining towns did. It ended in a single night, and what came after was almost as strange. A town built on ambition, undone by a single winter night, still standing untouched over 100 years later. Kerwin remains proof that even the most determined engineering effort can't always outlast nature's timing. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more forgotten history.